Hello and welcome to the Jank Bank. My name is Brad and I'll be your host as we explore fun, unusual, and unique commander decks that can still hold their own and win games. As a quick disclaimer, these decks are tuned to my own personal budget and meta, so feel free to make changes as necessary. Today's deck is a skeleton tribal deck with some serious combo potential I'm calling Ton Skeleton. The commander for this deck is Morophon the Boundless, a 6/6 shapeshifter for 7 colorless mana. Morophon is every creature type, and when it enters the battlefield, we choose a creature type. Creatures we cast of that type cost Wooburg less to cast and get +1/+1. The cost reduction Morophon gives our creatures allows for some explosive plays and even a few infinite combos. Before we get into that though, let's take a look at our skeletons. Drudge Skeletons, Restless Dead, and Unworthy Dead can each be regenerated for a single mana. Wall of Bone does the same but has Defender, and Drudge Reavers has Flash so we can play it at instant speed. Augur of Bones regenerates for 2 mana, and we can sacrifice it during our upkeep to make target player discard 2 cards. Cinderbones also regenerates for 2 and deals damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. And Grim Roustabout regenerates for 2 and has Unleash, which lets it interplay with a +1/+1 counter on it, but it can't block. Next we have Limdell's Highguard, which regenerates for 2 and has First Strike, and Manor's Skeleton, which regenerates for 2 and has Haste. These skeletons are going to help us protect our life total while we set up to combo off. Next, we have Rakdos Ringleader, which regenerates for a single mana, has First Strike, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they discard a card at random. And Skeletal Vampire, which has Flying, and enters play with 2 1/1 flying bat tokens. We can pay 3 and 2 black and sacrifice a bat to make 2 more bat tokens, and we can also sacrifice a bat to regenerate Skeletal Vampire. Now all of our skeletons so far are hard to remove, but don't pose much of a threat to our opponents on their own. So let's power them up a bit, starting with Paragon of Open Graves, which gives all of our other black creatures +1/+1, and we can tap it and pay 2 and a black to give a black creature Death Touch until end of turn. Speaking of Death Touch, we also have Death Baron, which gives all of our skeletons +1/+1 and Death Touch. Next, we have Adaptive Automaton, which enters the battlefield as a skeleton and gives our skeletons +1/+1. And Metallic Mimic, which enters the battlefield as a skeleton and gives our skeletons an additional +1/+1 counter when they enter the battlefield. Gutterbones enters the battlefield tapped, and if it's our turn and an opponent has lost life, we can pay 1 and a black to return it from our graveyard to our hand. Sanitarium Skeleton can also return to our hand from our graveyard for 2 and a black. And when Tenacious Dead dies, we can pay 1 and a black to return it to the battlefield tapped. Lastly, we have the 3 best skeletons in the deck with Reassembling Skeleton, which we can pay 1 and a black to return from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Mortis Strider, which returns to our hand when it dies. And Emir Houseguard, which has Fear, is a free sack outlet, and we can also pay 1 black and discard it to tutor for any 4 CMC spell in our deck. Now the goal of this deck is to combo off, so let's take a look at some of our combo pieces. Starting with Herald's Horn, which reduces the cost of our skeletons by 1, and at the beginning of our upkeep, let's just look at the top card of our library. Then, if it's a skeleton, it goes into our hand. Vanquisher's Banner gives all of our skeletons +1/+1 and lets us draw a card whenever we cast one. And Door of Destinies gets a charge counter whenever we cast a skeleton, and skeletons we control get +1/+1 for each charge counter on it. Desecrated Tomb lets us create a 1/1 flying bat token whenever a creature leaves our graveyard. Open the Graves lets us create a 2/2 zombie token whenever a non-token creature we control dies. And Dictate of Erebos has Flash, and whenever a creature we control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. Finishing up our combo pieces is Phyrexian Altar, which lets us sacrifice a creature to add 1 mana of any color. Ashnod's Altar, which lets us sacrifice a creature to add 2 colorless mana. And Altar of Dementia, which lets us sacrifice a creature to mill an opponent for a number of cards equal to that creature's power. Before we move on, here's a quick example of one way we can win with this deck. Say we have Morophon, Bantu's Monument, and Ashnod's Altar in play. Well, the cost reduction from Morophon and Monument makes Mortis Strider's casting cost 0. So we play Mortis Strider, deal 1 damage to each of our opponents and gain a life, then sacrifice it to Ashnod's Altar, which returns it to our hand so we can go through the entire process again and drain all of our opponents to death. While playtesting this deck, I also managed to make infinite bats and or zombies, mill all of my opponents, and make infinite power skeletons. So now that we know how the deck works, let's take a look at how we're going to get all the mana we need with the ramp. When Solemn Simulacrum enters the battlefield, we can search our library for a basic land and put it into play tapped. Then when it dies, we can draw a card. Burnished Heart lets us pay 3 mana and sacrifice it to search our library for up to 2 basic lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. An Expedition Map lets us pay 2, tap and sacrifice it to search our library for any land and put it into our hand. Next, we have Bontu's Monument, which reduces the cost of our black creature spells by 1, and whenever we cast a creature spell, each opponent loses 1 life, and we gain 1 life. And Jet Medallion, which reduces the cost of all of our black spells by 1. Everflowing Chalice has Multi-Kicker 2, and enters the battlefield with a charge counter for each time we kicked it. It taps for a colorless mana equal to the number of charge counters on it. Astral Cornucopia is similar, but we pay 3 mana for each charge counter we want to put on it, and it taps for mana of any color. Lastly, we have Soul Ring, which costs 1 and taps for 2, Crypt Gas, which has Extort and lets our swamps tap for 2 mana, and Black Market, which gets a charge counter whenever a creature dies, and at the beginning of our pre-combat main phase, adds a black mana for each charge counter on it. Now, in order for our combos to work, we're going to need several key pieces. So let's look at how we're going to get them into our hand with draw power. Sign in Blood lets us pay 2 life to draw 2 cards. Read the Bones lets us pay 2 life to scry 2 and then draw 2 cards. And Siphon Mine makes each of our opponents discard a card, and then we draw a card for each card discarded this way. Next, we have Greed, an enchantment which lets us pay a black and 2 life to draw a card. And Underworld Connections enchants a land and lets us tap it and pay 1 life to draw a card. Skull Clamp gives the equipped creature +1/-1, and when it dies, we draw 2 cards. This is extremely powerful with something like Reassembling Skeleton, which we can replay from our graveyard. And Phyrexian Arena lets us draw a card at the beginning of our upkeep for the low cost of 1 life. Lastly, we have just a few tutors with Diabolic Intent, which lets us sacrifice a creature to search our library for any card and put it into our hand. Diabolic Tutor, which also lets us search our library for any card and put it into our hand, but does cost a little more mana. And Mastermind's Acquisition, which does the same. Now let's take a look at how we're going to deal with our opponent's threats with the removal. Starting things off, we have some Flavor Winds with Bone Splinters, which is going to let us sacrifice a creature to destroy a creature, and Chill to the Bone, which destroys target non-snow creature. Next, we have Go for the Throat, which destroys target non-artifact creature, Tragic Slip, which gives target creature -13/-13 as long as a creature died this turn, and Murder, which destroys target creature. Moving on to board wipes, we have Crypt Rats, which lets us pay X to deal X damage to every creature and player, Crux of Fate, which lets us choose between destroying all dragon or all non-dragon creatures, and Torment of Hailfire, which costs X and 2 black, and for each mana we put into X, each opponent has to sacrifice a non-land permanent, discard a card, or lose 3 life. Lastly, we have Plague Wind, which destroys all creatures we don't control and they can't be regenerated, and Ingaruk's Wake, which destroys all creatures and planeswalkers we don't control. And that's it for the spells in the deck, so let's check out the lands that are going to help us cast them. Arch of Araska taps for a colorless mana, or we can tap it and pay 5 to draw a card if we have the City's Blessing. Cabal Stronghold taps for a colorless, or we can pay 3 and tap it to add a black for each basic swamp we control. And Cabal Coffers, we can pay 2 and tap to add a black for each swamp we control. Lastly, we have a whopping 35 basic swamps. And that's going to do it for this week's deck, but I really want to hear what you think of it, so please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay up to date on all the latest episodes. You can also follow us on social media to see how the next video is coming along, links to which are in the description below. If you would like to support the channel directly, there's also a link to our Patreon in the description below. Being a patron has a lot of benefits, including early looks at the next episode, your name in the credits, and even a tier where you get a deck tech based on your own idea. I'd also like to say a quick thank you to everyone who has subscribed and left feedback so far, and a very big thanks to our patron, Walton Shelby Rawlins. And with that, we bring the show to a close. See you next time, guys, and stay janky. The Jank Bank is part of the Creators Quarters community. For more great Magic content, click the playlist link in the top right.